Miss Sandra woke up before dawn, as she did every morning. The small apartment she shared with her daughter Betty was modest but always clean. The sound of early morning hustlers calling out their wares drifted in from the streets of Lagos. She stretched, yawned, and looked at the clock on the wall. 5:30 a.m. She turned to the small mattress where her daughter lay, curled up under the thin blanket. Sandra's heart swelled with pride. Betty was her world, her reason for working so hard. She gently shook her. "Betty, wake up, my love. You need to start getting ready for school." Betty groaned, turning away. "Just 5 more minutes, Mama," she mumbled sleepily. Sandra chuckled and playfully tapped her daughter's leg. "No way, my dear. The early bird catches the worm. You know you're the best in your class. We can't be late." At the mention of school, Betty sat up, rubbing her eyes. She was an intelligent girl, always the top of her class, and her teacher, Miss Janet, often praised her for her hard work. As Sandra prepared breakfast, simple bread and tea, she thought about her life. Being a single mother had not been easy. Betty's father had left her as soon as he found out she was pregnant. She had struggled, working multiple jobs just to provide for her daughter. But things were about to change. A few days ago, she had been hired as a personal assistant to Honourable Bello, a wealthy businessman and politician. It was a dream come true. She would finally be able to give Betty the life she deserved. She turned to her daughter and held her hand. "I promise you, Betty, our lives are about to get better." Betty smiled. "I believe you, Mama." They finished breakfast, and Sandra walked Betty to the bus stop before rushing off to catch her own bus. Today was her first official day at work. Sandra adjusted her dress as she stood in front of the grand office building. The company was massive. She took a deep breath and walked in. The receptionist, a young woman with bright red lipstick, smiled at her. "Good morning, Ma. How may I help you?" "I'm Sandra, the new personal assistant to Honourable Bello." The receptionist nodded and made a quick call. "All right, you can go in. His office is on the top floor." Sandra entered the elevator, her heart pounding. This was her big opportunity. She had heard a lot about Honourable Bello. He was a rich and powerful man, respected in business and feared in politics. But she also knew that his reputation wasn't entirely clean. Some said he only cared about himself, pretending to be a good man in public while exploiting people behind closed doors. As the elevator doors opened, a young man in a suit approached her. "You must be Sandra," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Tony, Honourable Bello's Chief of Staff. Welcome." Sandra shook his hand and smiled politely. "Thank you." Tony led her to a large office where Honourable Bello sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a tall, dark-skinned man in his early 50s. His sharp eyes scanned her as she entered. "Ah, you must be my new assistant," he said in a deep voice. "Yes, sir." He gestured for her to sit. "I expect loyalty, hard work, and absolute discretion. This is a demanding job, but if you do well, you'll be rewarded. Do you understand?" Sandra nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good." He leaned back, studying her. "I have a meeting in 30 minutes. Get me a summary of today's agenda from Tony and organize the files on my desk." Sandra wasted no time getting to work. She moved quickly, proving she was competent and efficient. By the end of the day, Honourable Bello was impressed. "You're smart," he said. "I like that. Keep it up." Sandra smiled. "Thank you, sir." This was just the beginning. Betty sat in class, listening attentively as Miss Janet explained a mathematics problem. "Who can solve this on the board?" the teacher asked. Several hands shot up, but Miss Janet smiled at Betty. "Betty, come and solve it for us." Betty walked confidently to the board and solved the problem within seconds. "Excellent," Miss Janet clapped. "Everyone should learn from Betty. She's hard-working and dedicated." The class murmured in admiration, and Betty beamed with pride. At the end of the school day, Miss Janet called Betty aside. "How is your mother, dear?" "She's fine, Ma. She got a new job," Betty said excitedly. Miss Janet smiled warmly. "That's wonderful news. She deserves all the good things in life." Betty nodded. Yes, Ma, she works so hard for me. One day, I'll make her proud and give her a better life. You're already making her proud, my dear. Keep it up. Betty smiled and left. Sandra adjusted her dress as she stepped into Honourable Bellow's office, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. It had been months since she started working as his personal assistant, and within that time her life had changed completely. At first, working for him had been nothing more than a job, an opportunity to provide a better life for her daughter, Betty. But as time passed, things took a different turn. Honourable Bellow, the wealthy businessman and politician, had taken a special interest in her. He was powerful, influential, and always surrounded by important people. Yet when they were alone, he spoke to her with a softness she hadn't expected. Sandra had been hesitant at first. She knew the kind of man he was. Selfish, calculating, and always looking out for himself. His reputation was filled with scandals, and though he tried to act like a good man in public, she had seen his true nature behind closed doors. But then, he started showing her a different side. He listened to her, praised her intelligence, and made her feel special in a way no man had before. The expensive gifts, the private dinners, the way he looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. It was impossible to resist. And before she knew it, she had fallen in love with him. One evening, as they sat in his luxurious office, Bella reached for her hand. Sandra, I want you in my life, permanently. She looked at him, surprised. What do you mean, sir? I mean, I want to marry you, he said firmly. Be my second wife. Sandra's heart pounded. Marriage? It felt unreal. She had spent so many years struggling as a single mother, dreaming of a better life for herself and Betty. Now, here was a man offering her wealth, security, and a place beside him. But your children? She asked cautiously. They live in the United States, he said dismissively. They won't be a problem. Sandra hesitated. She knew people would talk, but was that more important than securing a good future for herself and her daughter? She had suffered enough. It was time for her to enjoy life. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the proposal. Then, she turned to Betty, who was lying beside her. Betty, I have something to tell you. Betty turned to her mother. What is it, Mama? Sandra took a deep breath. I'm in love. Mexico's eyes widened. With who? Sandra hesitated, then said softly, Honourable Bellow? What? He asked me to marry him, Sandra continued, and I said yes. Betty sat up, frowning. Mama, you can't be serious. That man has too many scandals. He only cares about himself. People say he's corrupt. Why would you want to marry him? Sandra sighed. Betty, you don't understand. This is our chance at a better life. No more struggling. No more worrying about school fees or rent. We will be taken care of. Betty shook her head. But at what cost? Mama, do you even love him, or do you just love what he can give you? Sandra's eyes flashed. Love isn't always about feelings, Betty. It's about security, about making the right choices. Betty looked at her mother with disappointment. I don't like this, Mama. Something doesn't feel right. Sandra's patience snapped. Enough, Betty. I have made my decision and you will respect it. I am marrying Honourable Bellow whether you like it or not. Betty swallowed hard, her heart sinking. She had no choice but to accept it. 2 weeks later, Sandra and Betty packed their belongings and moved into Honourable Bellow's grand mansion. As they stood in front of the massive gate, Betty couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change. Forever. Honourable Bellow welcomed Sandra and Betty warmly, making sure they settled into the mansion comfortably. Betty was surprised at how kind he was to her. She had expected him to be cold and distant given his reputation, but instead he treated her with open arms. This is your home now, Betty, he said with a smile. I want you to be comfortable. Sandra beamed, pleased with how things were going. She had made the right decision, and soon Betty would see that too. The mansion was breathtaking. The high ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and well-decorated rooms felt like something out of a movie. Betty had never lived in such luxury before. There were maids, chefs, and even a personal driver assigned to her. Everything she could ever need was at her fingertips, yet something inside her felt uneasy. A few weeks passed, and Betty was slowly adjusting to her new life when something unexpected happened. Honorable Bellow's first son, Josh, returned from the United States, and Sandra personally made a special meal to welcome him. His deep brown eyes scanned the room before settling on Sandra. "Ah, the famous Sandra," he said with a grin, walking over to hug her. "Dad has told me a lot about you." Sandra laughed nervously. "I hope all good things." "Of course," Josh replied, then turned to Betty. "And you must be Betty." Betty nodded politely. "Nice to meet you." Josh smiled. "Likewise." There was something about his smile that made Betty uncomfortable. It wasn't warm, it was mischievous, like he was sizing her up for something. That night, they all sat at the long dining table, enjoying the meal Sandra had prepared. Honorable Bellow was in high spirits, talking about his latest business deal. Josh kept throwing glances at Betty, and she tried her best to ignore him. After dinner, Betty excused herself and went to her room. She wasn't sure what it was, but she felt like things were about to change, and not in a good way. The next morning, she got dressed for school as usual. A black, sleek car was already waiting for her outside, and her personal driver, Mr. Ade, opened the door for her. As the car drove through the city streets, Betty stared out the window, lost in thought. She was living in a mansion, wearing expensive clothes and being driven in a luxury car, things she had only dreamed of. But something still didn't feel right. At school, she was a completely different person. She was intelligent, always top of her class, and loved by her teachers. Her class teacher, Miss Janet, had always been fond of her. "Betty, as brilliant as ever," Miss Janet said with a proud smile as she handed Betty her test results. 100%. Betty smiled. "Thank you, Miss Janet. You have a bright future ahead of you, my dear. Keep working hard," the teacher encouraged. Betty nodded, feeling a sense of peace in school that she didn't feel at home. But home was changing. Ever since Sandra married Honorable Bellow, she had become a different person. She was no longer the mother who was always there for Betty. Now she was always traveling with her new husband. Every business trip, every political event, Sandra was there by his side. Sometimes she would be gone for weeks, leaving Betty alone in the massive mansion. Betty barely saw her mother anymore. The only thing Sandra did before leaving was make sure Betty had everything she needed. But was that enough? Betty lay curled up on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was eerily quiet. Her mother had been gone for over a week now, traveling with Honorable Bellow. The only people in the house were the domestic helpers and Josh. She hated being alone with him. Since the night he first entered her room, her life had become a nightmare. She could still feel the weight of his body, hear his whispers in her ear, and remember how she had cried, begging him to stop. But Josh didn't stop, and when it was over, he had leaned down and whispered, "You will never tell anyone. If you do, no one will believe you." Betty had wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone. But who would listen? Her mother was never around anymore. The maids worked under Honorable Bellow and wouldn't dare say a word against his son. So she stayed silent. But silence didn't stop Josh. Every night, when the house was dark and still, she would hear his footsteps approaching her room. She would lock the door, but somehow he always found a way in. It became a routine. He would come, do what he wanted, and leave her in tears. Her once bright, cheerful spirit was fading. She no longer smiled at school, no longer looked forward to coming home. Even Miss Janet noticed. "Betty, are you okay?" she asked one day after class. Betty forced a smile. "Yes, Miss Janet, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. She was drowning in pain, and no one could see it. Then, one night, everything changed. Josh had entered her room again, just as he always did, but this time, as he was leaving, the door suddenly swung open. Honourable Bello stood there. Betty's heart leapt with hope. Finally, he will stop Josh. He will protect me. Josh froze, his face pale. Dad, But before he could finish, Honourable Bello raised a hand. Go to your room. Josh hurried out, his head down. Betty sat up, wiping her tears, waiting for Honourable Bello to say something, to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. Instead, he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. Something in his eyes made Betty's blood turn cold. He walked toward her, his expression unreadable. Betty, he said, his voice calm. You're a smart girl, you know how things work in this house. Betty shook her head, her heart racing. Please, please don't. But he didn't listen. And just like that, her world shattered all over again. She cried, she begged, but nothing changed. If she thought Josh was a nightmare, Honourable Bello was a monster. Now, she was trapped between father and son, caught in a world she couldn't escape. She wanted to run, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. Then one day, she gathered every ounce of courage she had left. Her mother had returned from her trip, looking radiant and happy, as if she was living the dream life. Betty sat in the living room, waiting for the right moment. When Sandra finally sat down, Betty took a deep breath. Mama, I need to talk to you. Sandra sighed, barely looking up from her phone. What is it, Betty? Betty hesitated, her hands shaking. It's about Honourable Bello and Josh. Sandra's eyes flicked to her for a brief moment, before going back to her phone. What about them? Betty's throat felt tight. Mama, they come to my room at night. They hurt me. Sandra's fingers froze over her phone. Slowly she looked up, her expression unreadable. What are you saying? Tears spilled down Betty's cheeks. Mama, please, you have to listen to me. But before she could finish, Sandra's face hardened. Betty, stop this nonsense right now. Betty's heart sank. Mama, I'm telling the truth. Please, you have to help me. Sandra stood up, her voice sharp. You are just looking for attention. You don't want me to be happy, do you? You've been ungrateful since the day we moved here. Betty shook her head, sobbing. Mama, please. But Sandra wouldn't listen. She waved her hand dismissively. I don't want to hear any more of this foolishness. Betty watched in horror as her mother walked away, leaving her drowning in a pain no one cared about. Betty sat in class, staring blankly at the blackboard. The words written by the teacher made no sense to her. Her mind was elsewhere, lost in a dark place she couldn't escape from. Her once bright spirit had faded. She barely spoke to anyone. She no longer answered questions in class, even though she used to be the smartest student. She never smiled anymore. Even when her classmates tried to joke with her, she simply looked away. Miss Janet noticed everything. At first, she thought Betty was just stressed, but as the weeks passed, it became clear that something was very wrong. Her grades had dropped terribly. Her once neat and carefully written notes were now untidy, with missing pages. She knew she had to do something. One afternoon after school, Miss Janet called Betty before her driver arrived to pick her up. Betty, I've been watching you, Miss Janet said gently. This isn't you. Something is wrong. Betty shook her head quickly. I'm fine, Miss Janet. Miss Janet sighed. Are you sure? Betty nodded, her heart pounding. She wanted to tell the truth, to scream for help, but she couldn't. Honourable Bello's words echoed in her mind. If you tell anyone, I will ruin you and your mother. Josh's warning came right after. Nobody will believe you. If you talk, you will regret it. Betty swallowed hard. Fine, Miss Janet, I promise. But Miss Janet wasn't convinced. She tried calling Sandra several times, but every time Sandra had the same response. I'm too busy. Betty is fine. She's just adjusting to our new life." Miss Janet knew Sandra was lying to herself. She had to take matters into her own hands. The next day, she called Betty again after school. This time, she made sure to speak softly, reassuring Betty that she was in a safe place. Betty stood stiffly, afraid of what would happen if she spoke. But when she looked into Miss Janet's kind eyes, something inside her broke. Her lips trembled. Her body shook. Then, suddenly, the tears came. She cried so hard that she could barely speak. Miss Janet quickly pulled her close, wrapping her arms around her. "It's okay," Miss Janet whispered. "Take your time." Through her sobs, Betty finally let it out. She told Miss Janet everything. How Josh had been sneaking into her room. How Honourable Bello had caught him, but did nothing. How, instead, Honourable Bello became part of the nightmare. How she had tried to tell her mother, but Sandra refused to believe her. By the time Betty finished speaking, Miss Janet's eyes were filled with tears. She held Betty tightly, stroking her back. "I'm so sorry, Betty," she whispered. Betty buried her face in Miss Janet's shoulder, shaking. For the first time in a long time, she felt a tiny bit of relief. Someone finally knew her pain. But what now? Would Miss Janet help her? Or would she, like her mother, turn away? Miss Janet knew she couldn't go to Sandra with the truth. Sandra was too blinded by her new life to listen. If she truly wanted to help Betty, she had to do it another way. She took it upon herself to get Betty professional help. On several occasions, she took Betty to see a counsellor. At first, Betty was hesitant. She didn't believe talking to someone would change anything. But after a few sessions, she slowly started opening up. The counsellor was patient with her, helping her work through her pain, teaching her how to rebuild her confidence. It was a slow process, but little by little, Betty started feeling like herself again. She still carried the burden of what was happening to her, but now she wasn't completely alone. One day, Miss Janet and Betty sat together in an empty classroom. "Betty," Miss Janet said gently, "we need proof." Betty stiffened. "If we want to stop Honourable Bello and Josh, we need evidence," Miss Janet continued. "I believe you, but the world needs to see the truth." Betty lowered her head. The thought of exposing everything terrified her. "They threatened me," she whispered. "They said if I tell anyone, I'll regret it." Miss Janet reached for her hand. "You've already been so brave, but we need to put a stop to this, not just for you, but for other girls who might suffer because of them." Betty hesitated. The fear was strong, but the thought of finally being free was stronger. After a long silence, she nodded. "I'll do it." "You're doing the right thing." That night, Betty hid a small camera in her room. She made sure it was in a perfect position, where it could capture everything without being noticed. Her heart raced as she waited. And then, just like she feared, Josh came in first. He did what he always did, forcing himself on her while she sobbed, pleading for him to stop. And then, after he was done, Honourable Bello entered, continuing the horror. Betty wanted to scream, but she knew she had to endure it one last time. She couldn't let them know. She needed the proof. The next morning, with shaky hands, she handed the video to Miss Janet. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Please, end this." "I promise." Without wasting time, Miss Janet edited the video covering Betty's face, then uploaded the video to the internet. She sent it to every blog, every media outlet. Within hours, the video went viral. People were in shock. Honourable Bello, the respected businessman and politician, and his son Josh, exposed for their monstrous acts. The world was watching. And for the first time, Honourable Bello and Josh were the ones in fear. The moment Sandra saw the video, she knew instantly that was her daughter. Her entire world crumbled. She couldn't believe what she was watching. Her daughter, her precious Betty, was in tears, helpless, broken, and the men she had trusted, her husband and his son, had destroyed her child in the worst possible way. Sandra's hands trembled as she dropped the phone. Her breathing became shallow, her mind spinning with guilt, pain, and rage. How could she have been so blind? Betty had tried to tell her. She had cried for help, and Sandra had dismissed her. Tears streamed down her face. She had to find her daughter. She had to fix this. But Betty was gone. She wasn't in the mansion. The domestic staff whispered among themselves, avoiding Sandra's desperate gaze. Then her phone rang. "Miss Janet?" Sandra's heart pounded as she picked up. "Betty is with me," Miss Janet said softly. Sandra's legs nearly gave out. Relief and guilt crashed over her. "I'm coming," she choked out, grabbing her car keys. When she arrived at Miss Janet's house, she didn't even knock. She pushed the door open and rushed inside. And there was Betty, sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself. Sandra fell to her knees in front of her. "Betty," her voice broke as she reached for her daughter's hands. "I'm so sorry," Sandra sobbed. "I should have listened. I should have protected you." Betty's lips trembled, but she didn't speak. Sandra turned to Miss Janet. "This is all my fault." Miss Janet sighed. "You failed her, yes, but now, what matters is making it right." Sandra looked back at Betty, her voice trembling. I don't expect you to forgive me, but please let me be here for you now." Tears spilled down Betty's cheeks, and for the first time she nodded. Sandra pulled her into a hug, holding her as if she would never let go again. Meanwhile, Honourable Bello and Josh were in full panic mode. The video had spread like wildfire. Every major news outlet was talking about it. Social media was flooded with outrage. Women's rights activists were already demanding justice. Honourable Bello tried reaching out to his powerful political connections. No one answered. Even the people he had once helped were now avoiding him. The evidence was too damning. It was clear, undeniable, and disgusting. With nowhere else to turn, Honourable Bello and Josh made a desperate attempt to flee the country. Late at night, they packed their things, got into a black SUV, and headed to the airport. But they never made it past security. Law enforcement officers surrounded them the moment they arrived. There was no struggle, no argument. They had no escape. Handcuffs clicked around their wrists, and just like that, the powerful Honourable Bello and his son were dragged away in disgrace. By morning, the headlines screamed, "Honourable Bello and son arrested for heinous molestation and rape crimes." The country exploded with reactions. There were protests. People demanded the harshest punishment possible. Sandra saw the news, but it didn't bring her peace. Yes, justice was being served, but nothing could erase what had been done to Betty. Sandra knew that healing would be a long journey, so she made a choice. She quit her job. She dedicated herself entirely to Betty. She took her to counselling, stayed by her side, and held her through every nightmare, every panic attack, every moment of doubt. It wasn't easy. Some nights Betty would wake up screaming. Other times she refused to eat or speak for days. But Sandra never left her side. Little by little, Betty started to heal. She started smiling again, even if just a little. She began focusing on school once more. And most importantly, she started believing in herself again. The scars would never completely fade, but she was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. And Sandra? She had learned the hardest lesson of all. She had nearly lost her daughter to her own blind pursuit of wealth. Never again. From that day forward, Betty came first. And she always would. The end.